no place I would rather be. No place I would rather be. No place I would rather be than here in your love, than here in your love. There's no place I would rather be. No place I would rather be. No place I would rather be than here in your love, than here in your love.
Hello, we want to welcome you to Kingdom News Now. We have a wonderful program for you tonight. I have the special privilege of interviewing someone in our community that has been a tremendous blessing to the ladies in our community and to the community as a whole. And I feel really honored to have the opportunity to get to bring this interview to you tonight. I want to introduce you to to Pastor Sandra Mick. She has been an acquaintance of mine for some time. We've spoken together at different meetings and gotten to visit a little bit in the past. But I love her heart, and I love her heart for the ministry that she has carried out in the community, and her heart for the community as a whole. Sandra, I'm glad to have you tonight.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start by talking a little bit about your relationship with Christ. How did you come to know him? Were you raised in church and just have known him all your life, or is there a story behind that?
Well, actually, I am a first-generation Christian. I consider myself that. My parents, neither one were Christians.
Oh.
And actually, we grew up far from the things of God. My father, he had a drinking problem. He was an alcoholic, a good man. He worked. He was good. He wasn't abusive to my family or anything, or to me as a child, but he had a drinking problem. And then my mother eventually was led into an addiction problem of prescription drugs.
Wow.
And I grew up with that, hating that very thing, but found myself being pulled over into it too. It was what I saw before me, the only life that I knew, and it came natural to me. And so I began to follow the same pattern, only I took it to the next level and added illegal drugs to it.
Oh, wow. How old were you when you really began to search out your relationship with Christ?
I was 25.
Okay. So you already had a lot of water under the bridge.
Yes.
You were 25 years old.
Yes.
And how did that come about? Did you have a friend or someone that really influenced you in that direction?
Well, I was actually selling drugs at that point. I was the place that I had worked at was a bar restaurant combined, and it had burned. And I was selling drugs. I was drawing welfare. HUD was paying my rent, and I was selling drugs on the side. And my nephew came to me and bought a bag of pot from me. And somewhere down the line, he went to church with my older sister. Or actually my oldest sister, and he gave his heart to God, and he wanted to come back and talk to me about God. Well, the news was he was going to track me down and tell me about God, and I was terrified of him, which I had long ago, since I was a child, I had shut down my emotions. You know, I think it's AA that has a saying that there's 3 silent rules in dysfunctional families. That is, we don't talk, we don't trust, and we don't feel. And I had shut down my feelings, and I didn't know what I felt. Mostly anger is what came out all the time. And I really didn't want to see him, but he came, and you know, I had people come to me and tell me how bad I was. And you know,
that really didn't make the right impact, did
no,
it?
it didn't. It just made me angrier.
Yes, I can see that.
And so when he came to talk to me, he said, you know, God loves you.
Wow. And that was good news, wasn't it?
That was good news, because my first take on that was, how could God love somebody like me?
Yeah.
And I started crying. And remember, I'd shut my feelings down. I didn't cry.
Right.
And so he left, and about 2 weeks after that, I would go back to the same places that I went before, go to the bars and everything, but somehow the conversation would gravitate over to talking about God and what Randy had said about God to me, you know. And so anyway, this went on for about 2 weeks, December the 2nd, 1982 was when my life was transformed. And I had called Randy. He was working at the old Montgomery Ward building up here in Poplar Bluff, and I said, come by and talk to me on your way home.
Oh.
And I was living in a little trailer down at the trailer park at Culin, and he came by and he was telling me about God and how much God loved me and all this and wanted me to meet God. And I said, no, not right now. So he left, but he said something after he left, or before he left. He said, now after I leave, he said, you can still ask God into your life. And so I just put my hand over my heart, because we pledged allegiance to the flag and it had God's name in it. And that was probably about the most I knew about God.
Right.
So I said, God, if you're real, will you just come into my life?
Oh, wow.
And I felt him.
Immediately.
Immediately. My life was transformed forever.
That's wonderful. I love that, because sometimes we get in our mind that can only happen in a church, or that can only happen in a church setting. And the truth is that God hears our heart's cry all day long, everywhere that we are. And the minute that our heart is turned toward Him, the minute that we begin to truly seek from the depth of our heart, His Spirit just shows up in a place and shows us how real He really is.
Yes. Well, I got up the next day, and I slept so good that night for the first time, and I couldn't tell you how long it had been.
Oh, wow.
And I got up the next day, and I knew I couldn't continue the way things were. And I had of course, you think you're cool when you're dealing with drugs, you know, and I had my big stash out at my sister's house, and I had it locked up in a shed of hers. And I had some stuff on me. I had marijuana and some prescription drugs, and was a real heavy cigarette smoker. And on the way out to her house, God just started speaking to me. And He said, you can get rid of that pot because you won't need it anymore. And I opened up the bag of pot, held onto the corner of it, and let the pot go. And those prescription pills, you don't need those anymore either. And then I had some that everybody had given me along the prescription drugs. It wasn't mine, illegal prescription drugs. And then the speed, and he said, you don't need that either. And I had over 1,000 hits of speed out at my sister's house that wasn't paid for. It was fronted to me. And so I go out to my sister's house, and I told her, I said, you know, I got saved last night. And she said, you did? And I said, yeah. And I said, I feel like that God's telling me to get rid of all the drugs that I have. And she said, well, you better do it then.
Oh, wow.
And I said, well, it's not paid for. And she said, well, what does God say about that? And I said, well, it's like that God is saying that He'll take care of it.
Yeah.
And so I went out into the middle of a field, and I just threw everything that I had out in the middle of that field. And then I started back in, and I thought, well, what if somebody wants to go and get a hold of that, you know? And so I prayed that it would rain, and it did. It rained that night. And I guess that was December the 3rd, and I've never looked back.
Wow.
And I just knew that God had something great in store for me.
What a powerful testimony. One of the things that Jack and I, we have ministered to a lot of people who are struggling with addictions and seeking a way to get free from them. And we were recently, just a while back, speaking with a young lady who had been homeless and had really been through a great ordeal, and she said to me something that I'll never forget, these words. She said to me, if you want to tell me that I'm going to go to hell for what I'm doing, I don't know that would mean anything to me, because I feel like I've already been there and back. But she said, if you're telling me that God's love could wipe away the slate and make me clean and free from the guilt and the shame of what I've done, and that I could be accepted into a family with a brand new slate and free to start over, that could mean everything in the world to me. So we teach that God's love is the most difficult thing in the world to turn away from, because there's such a need for the love of God in not just in our region, but in the world.
Yes, there is.
And when someone comes in contact with the unconditional love of God, it's really hard even though you said your emotions were shut down and you had, already made up in your mind that you would never trust anything but the life you were living, God has a way of penetrating.
Yes, He does.
All of those barriers. And what a powerful testimony. And so from there, you've come a long ways from that time. God's used you in different ministries, and I guess that someone probably came looking for you after you destroyed all of those things. How did you get through that time and put all of that completely behind you?
Well, actually, that person was very patient. But there was another person that I owed money to, and remember it was December the 2nd, and I had a welfare check of $209 that I got in that month, and I had a 9-year-old daughter that I'd had at the age of 15, actually.
Oh, wow.
And I suffered a lot of abuse as a child growing up, and I had been through an awful lot of things, and had rightfully shut down my feelings because it wasn't right it wasn't easy to feel after some of the things that I'd gone through. But one person came by and I owed them $50 of the $209, and I knew that I had to pay that. And the other, probably 10 years later, I had the money to pay, and I went back to the person and I said, I want to pay for those drugs. And it made them very nervous, and they actually cut down the price quite a bit, but I did pay for them later. For one thing, I didn't feel like that I could witness to them real good, and it's just money, and so I went ahead and paid for them, and now when I see that person, I can witness to them and tell them about the good things that God has done in my life, and have no reservations.
It had to be the mercy of God that kept you from some very difficult situation in the middle of that, for them to be patient with you. It had to be God's hand in the middle of that. Wow. So from there, we know today that you have a church here in Poplar Bluff. When did you decide that God was dealing with your heart about ministry, and how did that come about?
Well, I kind of always knew that God had something for me, but I couldn't imagine God using somebody like me to do anything, if that makes sense. It's like, if God's going to use somebody, He's going to use somebody that's formally educated. He's going to use somebody that's, that's smooth and easy, to...
But what He was really looking for was a vessel that would say, yes, God, I'll do whatever it is that you want.
And allow Him to have the glory for everything that's done.
Absolutely.
And I knew there was a call in my life. I had, actually, I married a man. I met a guy that had been delivered from heroin, met him 2 months after I got saved. And we got married shortly afterward, and he was a chief engineer on a riverboat. And we'd been married and I'd never had anybody to love me the way this man did. And we had been married 5.5 years, and I had a highway patrol knock on my door and tell me that he had been killed in an accident, that he had, actually he died trying to save another man's life. And but God had delivered him from heroin, and he loved God, had a boldness in his heart about God. And it was like my life kind of fell apart. I was living down in the country around Grosley, Missouri. And I just didn't know where to go or what to do. And I thought, well, in this process of time, I should go back and get my GED because I dropped out of school in the 9th grade.
Okay.
And I was actually pregnant with my oldest daughter. And so I went ahead and went back to adult basic education and started working on my GED. And didn't take long, less than 6 months, and I was able to get it, and almost with a scholarship, and it was like God just helped me to be able to do that. And then, started some college classes. Then I met my second husband, Joe, that I'm married to now, and we met and fell in love. We dated a couple of years, and we got together, and I always knew there was a call on my life. By then, I'd moved to Poplar Bluff area, and we had was going to a non-denominational church, and I I got my exhorter's license through that ministry, and then became ordained, and then God just pulled me to the Assemblies of God, and confirmed it with my daughter, with my husband, with everybody around, and ended up going over to the Assemblies of God, and had to start from scratch, getting ordained. I had to go through some courses, which I felt like was good for me. It just helped me to be more stable and helped me to learn more about the things of God. And so went through those 33 courses and became ordained, and had just been ordained about a year. And I knew God was wanting to do something as far as a building, but it hadn't narrowed down, you know. At first I was thinking we'll just have a center that, for one thing, people like me that have been through a lot of trauma, what I found is it's really difficult for them to be in some of the typical churches, if that makes sense. For one thing, their attention span isn't very long.
Right.
And what I found with our ministries, we go through about an hour service, and that's about the best they can do. But what I would do is I'd beg people to go to church with me, and they would go, but when it carried on for 2 hours or more,
they would struggle with that.
They would struggle with it. And then whenever I would finally get them home, they would never come back with me again. And I felt like God showed me when we came over there, look, you may have them there for 2 hours, but they're not going to come back, and you're not really going to have them anyways, because they've learned that whenever they get uncomfortable to check out emotionally anyway.
So he was giving you a strategy for a specific section of the population who were going through similar things that you understood, and maybe someone else wouldn't understand. I like to share with the people, if you want to know what God's trained you for, look behind you.
Oh, that's good.
Because our lives have been training for what it is that God has ahead of us. We don't have to look behind us and grieve so much the past, as we can know that we came through that and we gained the knowledge and the skill set and the understanding and the compassion for people that we need to move forward and to use that for the glory of God.
You're exactly right. And what had happened was I was ordained April of 2007, and went to our sectional meeting at Cape Girardeau, January the 8th of 2008. And we get up there, and our presbyter says, we've got a little building down in Poplar Bluff that we're going to sell. It's a district-affiliated church, and we've just not been able to keep a church going there, and we're going to sell that building unless one of the ministries in Poplar Bluff wants it.
Oh.
And so my pastor at that time looked over and raised his eyebrow, and he said, I think that that might be your building. And my first thought was, I really didn't want to be in that area. And I said, well, I'll pray about it. And it was pouring down rain. It was a cold rain. And I got back to Poplar Bluff. I went over and found the building and got out and tried to peek through the top windows as much as I could, but something in my spirit just yelled, this is it.
Wow.
And I went home, didn't sleep. I was up at 5 o'clock in the morning and just thinking, wow, you know, this is it. This is it.
This is really happening.
I took my husband over, and I took him through the roughest part of town getting there. And he said, you're not coming over here. And so I talked with him a little bit. I said, well, now, if you don't want me to go over there, I can't go without your blessing.
Right.
And so in the process of time, he said, well, you go ahead if you think you want to. Well, my pastor at that time had just, I had just had a new grandson named Hayden that lives out on the East Coast, and I had just gotten back from there, and when we got the building, this was in February by now, and I just got back. He had some complications, though, and I had to leave the day before he was released. He was in ICU, and just got to hold him for a few minutes, and I took my time, and I got back. Well, my pastor called me in, and he said, I just wondered, would you be willing to do a church plant boot camp? And I said, well, sure. I said, I'm sure that I could learn a lot by doing a church plant boot camp. And he said, well, now I'll tell you the rest of the story. This will be about 2 hours from that new grandbaby you just had. Yay. The church will pay your way over, and you'll get a rental car. You go early, and you go spend some time with that grandbaby, and then you meet me at Falling Waters, West Virginia. And so that's exactly what I did, and I was so excited. I got to see the little grandson, Hayden, and we go over to Falling Waters, West Virginia, and I had kind of felt like that I had wasted 25 years. And the first thing they did was they had us to do a timeline to tell what all we had been through, and to put every monumental moment that we could remember on that timeline from the time we were born to that date. And then they said, this is where your ministry will flow from. And
that's amazing. That's just exactly like what we have taught and what I was saying. And I believe that is God's purpose. Nothing we ever go through is in vain. It's all for a reason and for a purpose. And he makes everything work together for good.
Yes, he does.
For those that love him. And even your grandson and your heart longing to have that time, that's the amazing God that I serve. Many times in our lives he's done many things like that. And that's part of the reason that we wanted to do Kingdom News Now, because we hear so much news and so much information. We're inundated in this generation with information all day long. And our hope is that someone can hear a word of encouragement and a word of life, and that they can live in their lives and see the experiences that we've had and be encouraged to know that there is light at the end of the tunnel, that God is faithful in the end. And so that's an amazing story. So by then you knew that he was going to use all of those things that you'd been through.
Yes.
And so how long was it before you actually began the ministry?
We had, the building really needed some work done on it. So we go over and we start working and repairing the building. The basement wasn't finished at all. And we worked, and it was full of stuff. It was like some stuff that wasn't any good, and just a lot of stuff, a lot of work. And we went over and we did a lot of work on the